Coming to tonight's program, let me read a very brief bios of our panelists. Michal Kosinski is assistant professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business. He runs projects that mix psychology, sociology, and data science. And previously, he was deputy director of the University of Cambridge Psychometric Center and a researcher at Microsoft Research. Irina Raicu is the director of the Internet Ethics Program at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Her articles have appeared in a number of publications, Atlantic, USA Today, Huffington Post, and so on. She's a member of the Partnership on AI's working group on fair, transparent, and accountable AI. And Simina Mistreanu is a China-based journalist whose work spanning everything from China's social credit system to the crackdown against minorities in Xinjiang has appeared in publications such as the Washington Post, the Foreign Policy, the Guardian, Al Jazeera, and so on. Let me stop the screen so now we can see all of us. So I will start very brief introduction from me. So I need to share the screen again. First I have to share the screen. And then not this one. Let's see if I have a chance to change PowerPoint. Are you seeing my screen?
No, we don't.
See me?
We can see you though, Piero.
Yeah, I thought I share screen. Okay, now you should see it, right?
We do, yes.
Okay, so so the idea actually came earlier when we still had the physical lasers. I wanted to do an evening on George Orwell's 1984, famous novel published in 1949. Orwell died last year, so last year was the 70th anniversary. And one thing that intrigued me about 1984 is that it was published in the same year when the first programmable computer was introduced. If you're British, in Cambridge; if you're American, somewhere in the United States. But 1949 is when we started having programmable computers. So, you can say that's also the year when the computer algorithm is born. Of course, there are no algorithms in George Orwell's novel. I have no idea if he was aware of what was happening in computers. But it's kind of interesting to think that he had this vision that didn't use algorithms. And today we live in the world in which, in a sense, algorithms are implementing his dystopia. So now this is the Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. So for those of you who think that this panel has nothing to do with art, just a reminder that more and more artists are using algorithms. So we live in the age of the algorithmic art. These are just some of the art events that were highly publicized by the media. Another observation I want to make at the beginning is that algorithms rate us. We are surrounded by them, and way before the age of Google and Facebook. The credit score is the obvious one that most of us have seen. If we have applied for a loan or tried to buy a car on a loan. The DMV record, in a sense, it's an algorithm that rates how good a driver I am. And now we have reputation and ratings on everything from Airbnb, eBay, Yelp, and so on. And probably Irina will tell us more about this. Algorithms are even used to help courts decide a sentence. So if you put all of this together, we sort of live in a decentralized social credit system. China is a centralized social credit system, and we'll hear about this from Simina, but we also have our own, except it's a sort of decentralized, not run centrally by a government. Now, one could argue that algorithms have always existed. Any code or law is a set of algorithms, so you can go back to Hammurabi's code. Religious scriptures have algorithms like the Ten Commandments or the Buddhist karma. One can argue the US Constitution and all the apparatus around it for the smooth transition of power is an algorithm that just saved us from a coup. Recipes are algorithms. The tea ceremony is an algorithm. Etiquette is a set of algorithms. So what's different? Well, the computer algorithm is different in many ways. In particular, algorithms have become invisible and inscrutable. Algorithms are driven by data, and we live in the age where you can have huge amounts of data to use. And the network algorithm, that sort of amplify the power of algorithms and makes them sort of the nervous system of our society. An important thing from my point of view, since my background is in mathematics and artificial intelligence, is to remind people that algorithms fail and just because they don't have the universal, the context of everything is going on. And this is something you can do right now on your computer. If you're using the most popular search engine, just ask when did China land a man on the moon? And you will get an answer that makes you think that on January 3rd, they did land a man on the moon. This is an algorithm that is trying to find the best possible answer to that question and fails. So anyway, that's my very brief introduction to some of the topics that triggered my interest to have this evening. Now, maybe Irina can pick up from here and tell us what are your main concerns with this algorithmic society that we are incrementally creating.
If we're going to start with the concerns, then we are going a little bit dark at the beginning. And I was just thinking that you can't tell us not to be dark if you're going to call these the last dialogues, right? Like that just sets us in that direction. But I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think there are a lot of concerns. The main concerns are the fact that, for me at least, my main concern is that some of these algorithms are being deployed in circumstances where they shouldn't be, where I think it's unethical to deploy them, in part because they fail in interesting ways, and we know that, and we should be making that clear to the people who have the power to implement them or not. And instead of making that clear, we've been sort of pitching the algorithms as solutions to things like human bias and deploying them at massive scale, like over an entire state, instead of being sort of humble and careful about that deployment. And I'm also interested in sort of finding what are the right places and the right kind of data sets on which to use the algorithms, because they can be extremely helpful, right? But I think we can characterize some of them as being helpful and helping humanity move forward, and some of them as being really problematic. I'm curious, by the way, you mentioned various things as algorithms that I would not have described as algorithms. You did say that recipes are algorithms, and I would have sort of said it the other way, that algorithms are recipes. But I didn't think, for example, that the 10 Commandments would be an algorithm. So I don't know if we want to get into that, but I'm curious what Michal would say about that.
Well, I agree with Piero that the 10 Commandments are, do not do that. And if you do, then you will go to hell or wherever else for a number of years. And DNA is an algorithm. We essentially live surrounded by algorithms. And interestingly, the black boxes are not, it's not just that computer algorithms became uninterpretable to humans. Law is largely uninterpretable to a normal human being. This is why we train lawyers for decades, and then those lawyers keep arguing about, what was the meaning of this particular paragraph in the law. So even those algorithms that are human readable and written in whatever language you are using are not entirely directly interpretable for all of us. Now, it's worth remembering that our brains are also running on algorithms, right? Those are, based on biological neural structures in our brain, but there's also an algorithm running in your brain. And as a psychologist, I'm focusing on researching those. And now, interestingly, also, brains are the ultimate black boxes. People who say we should not be ever using algorithms if we cannot interpret them, well, run into a problem of the following nature, that we cannot understand exactly how human brains work. As a psychologist, I can tell you we're just scratching the surface there. And yet we have been very successfully using those algorithms that run in our brains to make decisions, build wonderful technologies, create art, science, make our lives miserable or happy, depending on how you choose to apply this black box. And I just should mention, we're going to be talking for quite some time more, but I also wanted to mention one other thing, that while I'm focusing a lot in my work on the negative sides of the algorithms, and I think it's good to focus on those negative sides because this helps us to improve how those algorithms work and avoid some risks. I also wanted to say that I'm definitely an optimist. I think that for every disadvantage that those algorithms bring us, there are probably 10, if not 100 advantages that those algorithms bring to the society and individuals. And the same pertains to many other technologies, fires, iron, nuclear energy, have tremendous and awful downsides, but also bring great benefits to the humankind. And I think we should, while we are here, complaining about, I hope that would not be just complaining, but as we're complaining about risks, we should not forget that there are tremendous upsides there as well.
Yeah, Michal mentioned something that is a concern of mine. When you said we have to train lawyers to apply the law, because for the ordinary citizen, the law has become so complex. And that has happened a couple of times in my life, probably in everybody's life, that the consequences of an action was not clear. Recently, I simply wanted to add my wife to the title of a home, which sounds like a relatively simple thing to do. Well, nobody could tell me what the side effects would have been because my wife is a green card. She's not a citizen. And it turns out if you have a green card, you're not a citizen. Some of the things that apply to regular spouses don't apply. And nobody could tell me, literally. Basically, the advice I got, just do it and see what happens. So this happens when you have so many algorithms. You have the IRS, you have the title company, and each one is running an algorithm, and nobody really can see the whole thing. So that's one concern, that the society we're building has so many algorithms that the ordinary citizen is not aware that by doing one thing, it will have an impact in another field, typically at the IRS. So that's something that I don't know if we can limit, as we have more and more algorithms controlling our life. How can we have a way to simply press a button and see the consequences of my action?
So I wanted to add something else, and then I'm sure Simina wants to jump in as well. But all this talk of lawyers reminded me that I am one, and that I probably should have said from the beginning that all of the views I'm spouting off here are my own. They don't represent the views of the center and do not constitute legal advice. To go back to what Michal said, fire and nuclear energy are great if they're deployed in the right place, right? If you set fire in a child's bedroom, it's a very bad idea. And one of the stories I want to talk about is an algorithm that was proposed to be deployed in a child's bedroom. And there was a vast, roar of opposition from people that sort of kept it from this particular product from coming to market. But I think that's exactly what we're talking about. Like, how do we decide what are the areas in which the algorithms make perfect sense, these computational tools that allow us to find patterns in vast data sets that the human brain couldn't, and what are the areas in which if we deploy them, we lose some very important things for humanity.
Okay, so since okay, Simina, this is a good time to get. So we get if you just read the headlines, very superficial headlines in the newspapers, it sounds like China is ahead, not only in many technologies, but also in creating a decentralized social credit system. Can you tell us something about it? And I'm also curious how people perceive it.
Yeah, so there's this perception, I think, that's pretty widespread that China is indeed building a centralized social credit system. But the idea of centralization is more like a philosophical approach in China. I've interviewed researchers who are designing the social credit system. They work for big universities like Peking University in Beijing. And what they told me is that they want, so there will not ever probably in the near future be a unified platform where every Chinese citizen will have like a unique credit score. And that's been one of the misconceptions that have appeared in articles. Instead, the government has this vision of a self-regulating society that includes multitudes of smaller systems. So anything can be considered a social credit system. You can have, of course, there are like pilot projects in smaller cities where people's behavior actually results in like having a credit score being affected, and then people need to go to like the central government and pick up their score in order to access a bank loan, for example. But besides that, anything can be considered like the social credit system. I know your track record with like health insurance, your like your buying behaviors on Taobao. Anything is just like the government sees a very general, like broadly defined concept. And all these little pieces are supposed to like support each other and like work with each other to create a self-regulating individual who does not want to break the law, who wants to be trustworthy in order to access benefits. But what the government doesn't want is to create a system that will lead to pushback from people. So they don't want that like very rigid score that people may find unfair and then may lead them to revolt against the government.
What's the reaction from ordinary people? How aware are they and how do they see it?
Most people don't know. I think it's safe to say that most people in China don't know that there's a social credit system. People in smaller cities, for example, Rongcheng in Shandong province in eastern China, which is like has become quite well known for having its own pilot project. They know because they do have like in that case the local government, like the city government, runs a social credit score, and they feed in information such as like traffic violations, or so that if you have a traffic violation, that will bring down your score. But if you do something good for your community and you receive your little certificate, like you help someone, you organize a community event, you make a donation, then that can bring up your credit score. And when you need to buy a house or you need to like apply for a credit, then you need your score. Like you need to go. It's like one of the documents they need to collect. So people who have run into that, who have gone through that process, are aware of the social credit system, but in the vast majority of China, like nobody knows nor cares. Or if they know, they might have heard that there's like such a thing, but they don't know how it may be applied, and they don't know if it actually affects them. But they do want to like keep their behavior in check. If they've heard about it, they do want to be careful about, for example, like not littering on a train or like on the ground. on the street in order to like prevent something that they don't know about from like happening. It's kind of a like, I think it's intentionally vague, because if you don't know what can happen, then anything, I mean, can be used against you. So then you just try to keep yourself in check.
I must say, Simina, thanks a lot for this introduction to this subject. I must say that 2 years ago, we went with a bunch of other scholars to China on a trip to try to understand the social credit score a bit more. And there's also a privacy element, because China is now building this vast network of CCTV cameras that are, you know, filming everything. You know, in every corner you have a CCTV camera. Above the highways, there are CCTV cameras constantly recording what's happening. So we went there with a bunch of Western scientists and would try to interview people. And, you know, it would, behind closed doors, we would say, okay, guys, now you can tell us, you know, how much, you know, you feel oppressed by the system and how your life is now terrible. We'll never name you, and just help us understand this terrible new reality. And I must say that I was shocked, and I must say that my colleagues were also shocked. And it was just a bit of a reality check for us. We're essentially locals who, as you said, run into the system and also observe those cameras hanging out from every lamppost. Literally, in some streets, every lamppost has a camera hanging down from it. And the locals will be like, look, guys, you do not understand. You know, 5 years ago, I would be mugged on the street every single week. And now, for like years, you can come out at night, it's clean, safe, no one is mugging you, and so on. So look, guys, and this actually conclusion was that if you're privileged to live in Palo Alto, where, you know, the worst crime is that someone will not clean after the dog, then you may say, all right, you know, we don't need any cameras here in social credit system. But I must say that we should check our privilege, that there are places in the world where people are suffering from violence and mugging, not only government violence, just the violence from local thieves, and who are living in the world where people break the traffic rules and are just unpleasant and uncivilized to each other. And in those societies, we cannot just say, oh, you have this stupid social credit system, it's outrageous, because, you know, it comes with the risks. But in order to convince someone that this potentially is an intrusive system that gives government slightly too much power, perhaps we should first offer some alternatives to how to, you know, make sure that everyone is safe and a good upstanding citizen in the absence of such systems.
Okay, so I really need to jump in here, because first of all, I just want to note the irony of describing people as self-regulating citizens under the oppressive glare of all of these government. Like, you're self-regulating to the extent that society tells you what you should regulate yourself to, what standards and who you should be, right? I should also add, Michal, I think that's so naive. I'm sorry, the fact that you're behind closed doors and you think that the fact that you tell them you're not going to name them is going to reassure these people and actually allow them to speak freely to Westerners coming into China. I grew up in Romania when it was still communist. I came here when I was 13, so I can't say that I was some kind of, you know, dissident activist, you know, whatever, but I can still remember what it was like. And let me tell you, nobody was going to tell any foreigners anything real about their lives. And China is far more, I would say, in terms of surveillance and kind of keeping track of people. I think China is doing much more than Romania was doing at the time. I think Simina gets at something really interesting. The fact that something doesn't work doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work on people in terms of regulating what they do. If you have cameras, they might not be turned on, but if you tell them that they can see you and they're going to have facial recognition and identify whatever you do, sure, you're going to regulate yourself, not in the best way, not in something that we would want to encourage. If we want people to self-regulate, but this is not self-regulation. And I think, you know, when I think of China also, and I think of researchers building, to go back to algorithms, you know, algorithms that are supposed to be able to identify Uyghurs, right? I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the names, but that is one research that came out recently. You know, facial recognition can tell whether you're Uyghur or not. Given everything that's happening there, that's hugely problematic, right? And I find it fascinating. I mean, to your point, the fact that also if this is supposed to be a society regulating system, but most people don't know that it exists, then it's also not very effective, right?
Yeah, so the essential piece about China's social credit system is that the government wants people to be on board. So I agree partly with Michal in that, like, people who were aware of the social credit system the vast majority of them were on board because they saw the benefits that it brought them. And I mean, a lot of pragmatism is very widespread in China. Like, I think the way society is set up, like, you're always like on to the next goal. So then if the system keeps everything in check but brings me benefits, like it offers me the chance to apply for like to have a better apartment in a better neighborhood, then I'll be on board. But on the other hand, I mean, you can argue that it's unnecessary because I think China is one of the safest countries in the world as it is. And it's just one of the many ways in which the government is trying to like increase its power. And it works. I mean, China employs a variety of algorithms, like you mentioned Xinjiang and facial recognition. Like Xinjiang it's like an open state prison. And they track people based on their IDs, they track people based on their faces. And now, like, I think it would be interesting to touch upon the use of algorithms during the coronavirus outbreak, because now in China we use these apps that track our movement. So basically the government knows at any point whether we've been in one of the areas that has had a recent outbreak. And every time we enter any restaurant, every supermarket, we have to, even like taxis and like the Chinese version of Uber, we have to show our app that says, well, this person is safe. It's like has a green mark. And so basically we have all this information that the government has access to. But I think a lot of people are okay with that because they think, oh, but this has kept us safe for so long. And like, it's like, look at China. Like, a lot of Chinese people are very proud of China's ability to contain the coronavirus, and it has done that through algorithms, through tracking people. Like, you'll take a train to a city that has been affected by coronavirus. Like, they'll have a small outbreak. They had a small outbreak in Qingdao, a city by the ocean, during the October national holiday, and they had 12 cases. And not only did they track the majority of the people who lived in that city, and they tested 12 million people in like a few days, they also tracked everyone who left the city. Like, the community the community volunteer like showed up at my door because like I had traveled to that city during the holiday, and he was like, well, we know you've been to Qingdao, you need to get tested. And I was in Beijing, so they've done that for a lot of people. They just like use your cell phone data or train ticketing data to track you and to like make you comply. So,
and I think to build on what you said, I wanted to say that one of the core factors in order for society to function successfully is trust. And think about using eBay without having reputation score there. This would be essentially a place which is just very dangerous to buy anything if we were not able to track the reputation, so the social credit score for people who are selling and, by the way, buying stuff. And now what I'm also worried about is that when we talk about algorithms and we talk about the disadvantages that algorithms have, we often, then we say, look, there are certain disadvantages of this algorithm, we just cannot have it. And then we keep forgetting about the fact that we shouldn't be measuring algorithms or social, other mechanisms against perfection, because it doesn't exist. We should be measuring it against available alternatives. So if you say, okay, we don't need a social credit score, well, what are we having instead? Are people going to be giving each other loans and giving each other jobs without any reputation system? Of course not. They would just come up with a different reputation system. And I still remember times, let's say I'm from Poland. When I was growing up, In Poland, there was no credit score. So if you wanted to have a loan from the bank, you needed to show that you would know people who are wealthy and they will cover for you if you fail. Meaning that if you're poor and from underprivileged environment, forget about the loan. No banker will ever give you a loan. And then I come to America. I'm here for 1 year only. I have a very low salary. I'm working as a postdoc at the university. I have zero friends who have any money to cover for me. I go to a bank and the bank says, show me your credit score. My credit score shows that I have been paying for my phone every month without delay. And they say, okay, you don't know anyone, but we'll still give you a loan, and then we'll ramp up this loan as you are paying it back because you brought us this social, credit score, a credit score that I was deprived of in Poland. And in Poland, now his situation has changed because we have a credit score in Poland as well. But when I was growing up, the only way to get a loan was to get someone wealthy to know someone wealthy that would vouch for you. So I just want to warn once again, when we talk about those disadvantages of those algorithms, let's always think about, okay, what alternative do we have to an algorithm?
I completely agree, but you did not bring a social credit score. You brought a credit score. And if that worked for you then why do we need algorithms that also collect all the data about our friends and what we look like and what music we listen to and all of these other characters? If that worked and got you the loan, fantastic. And we should compare to alternatives. So that's
Irina, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, so I was saying, I agree that we should compare to alternatives. I just think that in some situations, the algorithms that we're building are actually making things actively worse and at scale and faster. And it takes us longer to even realize that that's what they're doing.
The problem, though, with a credit score is that if you're poor, you have a very low credit score. Now, if you're poor, you can still not steal the toilet paper and pay you're poor, you have low taxes, you pay them on time. And by the way, you're not crossing the street on the red light. Essentially, you're able to show that you are an upstanding citizen following the rules despite the lack of money. And now in America, we have a citizen score, but the citizen score is very highly linked with your income. Again, like it's better than no credit score whatsoever. But I would say that if I had a chance to show that I'm an upstanding citizen by, following other rules, like, not spitting on the ground and not littering and not crossing the road. And if I was gathering points in this way, I would be like, hell yeah, I'm not wealthy, but I still can build my credit. So in many ways, I would argue that the Chinese approach to social credit is more humane and brings more equality than American approach that is just based on money.
That's I can see both points of view, and you both have good points. The one problem I have again is the algorithms fail, and I don't know if there is a mechanism to appeal. I know in this country there isn't. I have a friend who cannot get a loan, and he swears he always paid his credit cards or whatever, but somehow the three big companies, whatever their names, have a very low credit score for him. He cannot get a loan. He doesn't know how. And myself, I'm an Italian driver. At one point, I got my 20th speeding ticket. I threw a party. And since then, I got 4 or 5 more, okay? And you probably never got to this point, but there's a point where the DMV sends you a letter telling you you're one of the worst drivers ever, okay? Now, take a wild guess how many accidents I've had. I've been driving for about 50 years. Take a guess how many accidents I caused in my life. 0. Okay, so that's an algorithm that doesn't really, maybe I'm amazingly lucky, but I know a lot of people who have had 0 speeding tickets and they did cause an accident. So how can you appeal in these cases? It's somebody has the evidence. I am not what the algorithm says. How can we appeal in these cases?
So Pierre, depends on what sorry, Irina, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so we often can't, right? That's part of the problem. There are now algorithms and these kind of, hidden credit scores that are keeping people from being able to rent an apartment, from getting loans, from getting health insurance, because there's sometimes just bad data behind them. And it's very hard to even know, whether it's data about you or somebody with the same name, and it's, very poorly collected and labeled, and we're still doing this. But I wanted to, I'm not going to defend your speeding, Piero. I wanted to take a different example. So in Michigan, the state deployed a system that included algorithms that were supposed to identify welfare fraud and prevent welfare fraud. It's a great thing, right? Why should we pay for welfare fraud? And they implemented it. And by the way, some of these stories, like I swear I couldn't have named them better. The name of the system is Midas. Remember King Midas? Everything he touched turned to gold, even his daughter, because that's not, he was solving the wrong problem by asking that everything he touched be turned into gold. That's kind of what happened in Michigan. Everything that this system touched turned into welfare fraud. They had a huge rise, they identified so many more cases. They immediately garnered people's wages. They went and they fined people. There was no way to appeal. And after a number of years, it turned out that the algorithm had something like this is from an article on the IEEE spectrum. So these are engineers criticizing the algorithm, not me. The algorithm had something like an 80-some% false positive rate. It was deployed for years, and there are now 2 massive class action lawsuits against the state and against the various companies who built this system by all of the people who were screwed over by this algorithm and who were not able to appeal, right? That's why they ended up eventually, with bankruptcies and all kinds of very serious things, including, by the way, of course, it ruined their credit score, right? That all of this stuff happened. So that's part of the problem here, is that this is what I meant by the fact that we are deploying some of these things without auditing them properly and at scale, and then keeping them going long after it becomes clear, because people are trying to appeal decisions, that something is very wrong there.
I think, Irina, that you are very right that we need more auditing, and we definitely need ways to appeal the decision that is unfair. And this pertains not only to algorithms, but to any other social situations, like, even getting a speeding ticket, you should have a right, and you do have a right to appeal this. But I also want to point out that in this story, you did not mention at all how many millions of dollars were saved because fraud that was prevented, right? This is not something that we focus on. I also want to say that sometimes 83 or even sometimes 90% false positive rate is a very good result. If we are having an algorithm that is aiming at something that is very rare, let's say if it's an algorithm that is aiming at fraud that happens just 1% of the time. Now, even an algorithm that has 99% accuracy, algorithms like that rarely exist. It's just very accurate. If you aim at something that is as rare as 1%, even if you have nearly perfect accuracy, you know what your false positive rate would be? Over 50%, around 50%, right? So we should not analyze those numbers essentially in the vacuum, right? And also, by the way, the fact that they were able to estimate those false positives means that there must have been some appeal system because, they identified something and then someone told them, look, I'm actually not defrauding and this is just some additional documents. And again, I would bring it back to an available alternative. If you do not have an algorithm that helps you to detect that, and you just, let's say, use a human officer that does it, a human bureaucrat, now we very well, as a psychologist, we have a very good understanding that people suffer from limitations and make mistakes all the time as well. When you have humans looking at those files, humans would look at age, gender, ethnicity, whether people speak with an accent or not. And subconsciously, and we know it as implicit bias, subconsciously use those signals that should have nothing to do with a fraud or not fraud, decision to guide the likelihood that they will just indicate something as a fraud or not. So if we say 83% false positive rate, the only way to interpret this number and be fair is to say, when you compare it with a human decision maker, this is a rate that is 10% or 20% higher or lower, whatnot. So there's this fallacy of a single number. They're just saying that something has a high false positive rate. Maybe it's high, but maybe it's 3 times lower than the false positive rate of a best available alternative.
I would be happy if we use these numbers. First of all, if we did these studies for every algorithm, and then we use these numbers to rate the algorithm, because the algorithm rates me. But we don't have a rating, we don't have the social credit score of the algorithm. The DMV algorithm, first of all, I'm not justifying myself about speeding. I'm perfectly fine. I'm perfectly fine that cops give tickets for speeding. But the point is, it's a very primitive algorithm. It doesn't tell you the whole story about the driving skills of the driver. And so I would rate that algorithm, I don't know, a 5 out of 10, as opposed to some other algorithms that I would rate 9 out of 10. And then society should take the algorithm based on its reputation, just like they use, my reputation is taken into account when I do something. So that's the problem I have with the fact that the algorithm is either 0 or 1, but it's not rated.
Well, I have another problem, though, with what Michal said, which is that we are now talking about percentages and numbers and leaving aside the fact that, again, in that case, the reason we have these massive class action lawsuits is because a lot of innocent people were harmed. So we are saying, what are we saying then? Are we saying that we're okay with people who did nothing wrong being, having their livelihoods and lives destroyed by these algorithms because we didn't deploy them carefully enough? I hope not. I don't think so. But I think that's the reality right now, right? We're deploying them in this and in the criminal justice system in ways in which we really should not, and in ways in which we are not reaching better results than we were with human decision makers. And this is measurable. I mean, we can identify that. I wanted to ask you also, Michal, really quickly, because I think I heard you, or I think I read you interviewed one time about a company that claimed that they could tell from somebody's face whether they were a terrorist or not. And I think that you were interviewed and that you said, because it's so rare, because the actual number of terrorists are so rare, the danger is that they're going to get so many false positives that it becomes completely useless, right? That by the time you start to investigate all these, or that if you're investigating all these false positives, or it becomes like the boy who cried wolf, no, he's a terrorist and he's a terrorist, that after 20 false positives, the 21st is a real one. But so what happens in those situations?
Irina, you're very right. In very many cases, you are essentially having mostly false positives. Let me give you a following example. When you're crossing the border, the officer at the border asks you for your passport, right? This is a false positive. They essentially ask you for your passport to check whether you're not crossing the border illegally, right? And of course, hopefully they catch someone only, once a day, or just 1 in 10,000, or sometimes probably even less. In terms of terrorists, people who are scanning your bags, hopefully just 1 in 10 million actually people are carrying a bomb and so on, right? So systems that have a lot of false positives, like everyone who is crossing, the border or goes through the airport security is essentially a false positive. Those are not rare systems. Now, but in this context, if you have an algorithm that can flag for you person that maybe should be looked at a bit more, and again, among people who should be looked at a bit more, there might be that there will be, in any given year, there are millions of people flying, maybe not that many this year, but on a normal year, we have a lot of people flying, and terrorists, luckily, are very rare. But still, a good algorithm should every day identify a few dozens or few hundred people who should be respectfully, but essentially maybe screen them a bit more for the benefit and safety of everyone else. And we should essentially not get offended by those false positive rates, but just try to make sure that it's done essentially respectfully and carefully. And now I again want to bring an alternative, a best available alternative here, which is essentially a judgment of a human officer. Now, a human officer gets tired. Human officer, it's racist, sexist, and ageist because guess what? Even if we think that we are not, we all are to some extent racist, sexist, and ageist. So now supporting or replacing the decision whom to screen more in detail of this officer by an algorithm is usually because, again, the beauty of the algorithm is that it can very easily calculate how efficient it is. And the evidence I've seen so far, and again, I'm working mostly talking about risks of the algorithms, but I try not to forget that the evidence I've seen so far is that whenever you replace the human decision maker with an algorithm, let's say deciding whom to screen at the airports, or whom to ask some more additional respectful questions, that it turns out that those algorithms end up being less prejudiced than what humans can essentially achieve, especially tired humans that have to work for 10 hours, doing their hard job.
I think a lot of machine learning disagree with that.
Simina wants to say something. Let's give her a chance.
I just wanted to bring into discussion, I think, an important point, which is that we need to also look at who designs the algorithms and what are the ethical implications of like their intentions and their positions and their objectives. Because you can have an algorithm that's very efficient, but it works toward a purpose that's not ethical or is not the common good. Like, for example, in Xinjiang, you have these checkpoints that ethnic minority people have to go through each time. The Han Chinese majority people don't have to go through them, but Uyghurs and Kazakhs, etc., have to go through them. And they work, for example, if someone has been imprisoned, when they have their ID checked at these checkpoints, it like sets off an alarm. So I was talking to this Uyghur man who had been sent to prison because he was running a Uyghur language kindergarten. This is normally not a reason to send someone to prison. But he spent a year in detention. And after that, every time he would go through a checkpoint, his ID would just set off an alarm. So the algorithm worked, but it kept this person in like a situation where it would have been just a matter of time until he would have ended up back in detention. And he said that like some like police like officers wouldn't understand that he had already served his time and he was free to go. So eventually he managed to leave the country through what could be described as a failure of an algorithm, because he had a residence card. It's called a hukou in China, that belonged to a different province, a different city in Lanzhou. And he tried to leave the country using his Lanzhou passport. And the people at the airport were suspicious of him because he was leaving from a city in Xinjiang. But they called, he was like, I'm a professor at this university where he actually used to teach. And they called the university, and the person who answered was like, yeah, he still teaches here. He lives in Lanzhou. He's not a Xinjiang person. He can, like, he's trustworthy. So he was allowed to leave, and that was probably his one chance to like to have a life in freedom. And he's an academic. So I think it's very important to consider the ethical implications of who designs the algorithm and for what purpose.
Of who designs the algorithm and on which data is the algorithm trained on, right? And who collected that data and why? Because we have these massive data sets that are being used now. They were often, collected for specific purposes, and they're being used for different purposes. And they're not, I think we have to be really careful not to pretend. So there's a Silicon Valley technologist named Matej Ceglowski who writes really well and who describes some of the stuff as bias laundering. We collect a bunch of data, which human beings collect. We then have human beings label the data as this and that. And then we have human beings determine what criteria go into the algorithm. And then we run through the algorithm, and now it's math. So now it's objective. And he argues that just because something is algorithmic, it doesn't mean that it's more free of bias than human beings are. And in fact, we've seen evidence, right, of deeply, deeply flawed algorithms that can't, for example, tell that, an African-American face is even a face, let alone, be able to recognize who the person is or whether, what the gender of that person is. I mean, this is widely known in the, machine learning community, right? I think the notion that algorithms save us from human biases suggest that there's something that they're not. They are artifacts of human beings. And I realize that deep learning means they go through all the neural networks and they do their own things, but they're still based on human reality. And I just want to give you just a little flavor in terms of the criminal justice system, right? We have these algorithms that are trained on past data, and then societal norms and even laws change. So we decriminalized, marijuana possession, let's say, right? But then we have algorithms that are trained on conviction data that still includes all the convictions for marijuana possessions. And now we apply them to people who are, so in a way, because we keep looking at historical data, we don't even keep up with the changes in societal norms that are happening that hopefully will, make us, live in better circumstances than we do already.
Irina, I think you're making very important points. You are essentially listing all of the possible ways in which you can design a very bad and very lousy algorithm. And so you're describing the shortcomings of the data that is available, and you're describing all of the errors and mistakes that people can make while training the algorithms. And also, as we all know, there are many examples of people building algorithms just stupid and silly and just not really built in the right way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot build a good algorithm. You cannot try to control for the biases present in the data. And, you know, it's a bit like with many other judgments. I can come up with stories of many Italians that I know that drive extremely badly and cause a lot of accidents. But we wouldn't like to judge Piero by the fact that there's many lousy Italian drivers out there as well. We should essentially judge every person and every algorithm separately based on the merits. So I essentially would argue that, look, that's true, there's many lousy algorithms. But if someone comes to me and says, look, I can show you an algorithm, and this algorithm is going to be making this decision, hiring, firing, sentencing, predicting reliability and trust and so on, name it. And I will give you this algorithm and I will tell you that this algorithm is better than the available alternative. I would say, well, I'm not going to judge this algorithm by the fact that there are many lousy algorithms like out there. I would just take this algorithm and see whether it's really better than the alternatives. And guess what? Once we implemented this algorithm that is better than the available alternative, I will still just look for people that would come and design even a better algorithm or improve the algorithm that we have at the moment. Now, one of the beautiful properties of the algorithms, and actually it's really funny because usually I'm the one criticizing algorithms, so I just find myself on the wrong side of this panel. But anyway, one amazing property of algorithms is that they do not get easily offended. If we tell the human police officer or human judge, look, you are racist and you are making those biased decisions, those people would say absolutely not true and just of course I'm not and so on, that they truly believe they're not. With an algorithm, we can apply algorithm to millions of archive cases and run simulations and so on and tell the algorithm, look, you're clearly racist. An algorithm would have absolutely zero problem with that. And if it can be improved, it will be improved.
Michal, what both you and Irina are saying things that I totally agree, but I have trouble visualizing the algorithm that determines which one is the better algorithm. Some algorithms were designed for relatively innocent reasons. Actually, a lot of algorithms are designed just to make money, right? Think of algorithms designed by social media to make money. They ended up creating echo chambers. They ended up spreading fake news and so on. I don't think that was the intention of the guy who designed the algorithm. So when you decide this algorithm is better, you really have to look at all the consequences of that algorithm. And I fail to visualize how you can do that. How can you determine this algorithm is better than the other one?
Piero, you're exactly right. And the fact that we're now using algorithms to make decisions is actually, I think, not only improving the quality of the decisions, but also forcing us to define exactly what do we want to achieve by this algorithm. And let me give you an example. You know, in the past, we were training drivers to drive cars, but we're not really giving any ethics classes to the drivers. We were never explaining to the driver, look, if you're driving and there's a family walking on the side of the road and you have a family in the car, this is how you should be weighing people's lives. You should be trying to save whatever, children, women. We were not talking about is why, because maybe we're just bad people, but actually more likely because in a context of an accident, people just don't have time to think. The most basic instincts kick in. And we, for example, have a lot of evidence that in a context of an accident, the driver would try to hit whatever they're supposed to hit with the side of the car with the passenger, even if the passenger is the person that they love more than life and themselves. When in the situation when they have microseconds to the side, the very low level of the brain, the survival instinct would kick in, and it would just make them essentially protect first of all themselves. So we were ignoring even all of those ethical questions. What should happen in the context of an accident? Now that we increasingly are talking about cars that are going to be driven by algorithms, we cannot avoid answering this question anymore. We have to essentially try to say, okay, in the context of an accident, whom should the algorithm try to protect first? The passenger, the driver, the pedestrian on the road, the cyclist, and so on. And people even bring this criticism. They say, well, but accidents happen so rarely, the algorithms, will have to make those decisions very rarely, which is not true. You're making a decision whether to protect the passerby person on the sidewalk or the driver every second you drive a car, right? How close you go to the curb, how fast you're driving, how you're behaving towards trucks versus how you're behaving towards cyclists when you're driving a car. In every second of driving, you're making a decision that puts some value on human life and puts a differential value on human life. And in some way, Piero, what you're talking about is extremely important, because now that we're moving away from those human instinctive decisions of this very complicated black box that is in our head to algorithms that we have some more control over, and we can also define their outcome functions and reward them for some things and so on. Suddenly we have to answer all of those questions that we have not had to answer before. And I think it's good oftentimes.
It's good as long as people understand that we are making value choices in every algorithm, right? And that's exactly what they're doing. But for a long time, that's not where the conversation went, right? The algorithms were just going to get rid of human biases. They were going to, and now we know that they encode, right? So mathematician Cathy O'Neill has said that algorithms are opinions embedded in code. And they are. So part of the question then becomes whose opinions, right? And I think this is when we talk about China, it's like, oh, it's the government's opinions embedded in code, right? It's not going to be a democratically chosen set of what gets applied in those algorithms, because that's not how that system works. And it's complicated here too, right? In terms of, it goes back to what Simina was saying, who is designing these algorithms? Are they even aware that they're playing that role? Because for a long time, I think, technologists didn't see themselves as these very powerful ethical actors in our society, which of course they are, right? But it's funny, earlier when you were saying that you're usually on the other side of the debate, I thought we were going to switch to talking about happy algorithms, right? What are the algorithms where, to Piero's point, we feel like these are clearly, doing good things in the world? And so I'm on the wrong side of the page now because I'm going to the happy algorithms.
Well, so before we talk about happy algorithms, I'm sure there are some. Let me just make one comment here, because you brought something extremely interesting. So you said, look, it's very potentially worrying that you have a government of a non-democratic country now defining those functions and so on, how those algorithms work and so on. But first of all, I want to say that those non-democratic governments, they're defining much more consequential things than algorithms. They're defining taxes, they're defining how police works, they're defining whom to arrest, whom to kill and so on, whom to, put in a concentration camp. So just saying that non-democratic and democratic governments can influence people's lives in many ways, probably even more painful than whatever they can do through algorithms. Now, but putting this aside, I think that there's a question we should be asking ourselves in America, which is, in America, we say, okay, it's very bad if a government decides, how the algorithms work or what can be published on social media. But what do we do in America instead? In America, the government says, well, we will not going to tell anyone what's okay to be published on social media or not. We will tell Facebook to make this decision. So now we don't have a democratically elected government making those decisions or some committee that is transparent and driven by some social values that we want to maximize. We have a for-profit, non-transparent company run from Silicon Valley by a bunch of technocrats with zero education, ethics, and history, and so on, deciding whether I can post something on Facebook or not, or whether to deplatform something. Like, I was for many years researching, privacy risks that Facebook is introducing to society, and one day they just closed my account, and there's absolutely no, way of trying to appeal this decision. So I think that I would actually prefer a government to decide what's allowable on social media and what's not, than to have a for-profit, private, non-transparent company do it for us. That's very worrying for me.
Yeah, what is worrying for me is that it's not just one for-profit company. There's a whole universe out there, and of course Facebook is the famous one, but there's many. So you can be subject to some kind of freedom limitation from unknown sources.
You know, what's funny though, is that I think in the US, a lot of governmental actors are being pitched algorithms as solutions to problems, and they don't have the technological know-how or understanding to really gauge whether they're being sold a bill of goods or not, right? And that's how we end up with some of the problems as well. So I want the third choice. First of all, I want, if it's going to be governmental action, I want it to be knowledgeable, right? I want a lot more technologists involved, and some have been in the FTC, in, you know, congressional staffing, and I think this is increasingly happening, but it needs to be much more for governments to be able to make wise decisions about things like algorithms and other technologies, right?
So before we run out of time, Alexa Smith has a question about privacy. So I'll synthesize as in, so I know there has been progress in trying to protect privacy, but obviously we're still in the situation where all these reputation systems can trade your information. What's the status? Are you guys up to date on what kind of protection we are putting in place?
For privacy in general, you mean? Or
yeah, in general,
I mean,
yeah.
I will say that California is trying harder than other parts of the country to protect privacy, and we've passed several laws now. There are other states as well, but it's not enough. And I think this is, you know, that there are all these sectors, like all the unregulated data brokers, the various, you know, hundreds and thousands of companies that just collect data about all of us all the time and then sell it as these sort of dossiers, and we have no idea and we can't correct the data. That doesn't even go to the kind of more sophisticated algorithms that we've been talking about, right? It's a much more basic problem. So there's a vast privacy problem in the United States with overlays of, you know, various things that happen with that data.
And just to build on what Irina said, because I fully agree that there's just the privacy is essentially gone in all practical terms, and even the best laws are, you know, are going to make the situation slightly better, but are not going to solve the problem. And I actually worry that in some ways they can make situation worse, because they will give us a false feeling of safety. If the government says I have the right to privacy, then I guess I have a right to privacy, completely forgetting that the government maybe can regulate Facebook and Google, but cannot really regulate, you know, the services of foreign countries, or a small little startup that doesn't even know that they're breaking the law, or hackers that are just trying to steal our identity or steal our data. So we should not have a sense of false security. And I think that it's also pretty intuitive to everyone today that if you go on Facebook and talk about your political views, or you go to a dating website and you reveal what your sexual orientation is, I think it's clear to everyone that, okay, if you reveal it online, then internet will know. And, you know, data companies that sell and trade data, they will sooner or later collect this data as well. But what I think is much less intuitive, and what I think people do not really realize it's happening, is that even if you have never discussed your political views online, even if you have never mentioned your sexual orientation online, or never watched any, you know, content that could reveal your political views or sexual orientation, the problem is that algorithms today can take very innocently looking data, your Facebook likes, your tweets, books you have read, you know, history of your geographical location, or even how you tap on your keyboard or how you use your phone, and then convert this data, this innocent looking data, into extremely accurate predictions of the most intimate traits you can think of. And there's essentially very little that we can do to avoid, you know, those predictions, to prevent those predictions from being made.
And I think you have a very good point. I think that was actually the topic of your laser presentation a couple of years ago. And it was stunning that, you know, we tend to think that we give private information to the algorithms. And actually it was stunning to realize that we don't. We think we are keeping things secret, but algorithms can pick up little things. And Michal was showing that they could determine your gender and your preference for this and that based on simple facts. So
I just want to clarify that this is very much what Michal is doing research on, but it's very controversial. again, it's not like there's some consensus that indeed, if you pick up on these various things, they will accurately describe, they will describe you, and it's being used to describe you right now, but whether it's accurate or not is in dispute. And just to go back for a second, because we were agreeing on it on some of that, but not on all. I am not saying that we have no privacy, and I'm not saying that we have no hope to regain our privacy. I think we may well be kind of a test generation in which so much data was collected and we didn't know what was happening and there was nothing we could do about it. But every new thought that comes into your mind is a new opportunity for privacy. And every new statement that you make to one person that you don't share to the whole world is a new opportunity for privacy. And maybe the next generation will be better protected, both by new laws and by new technologies, because there are a lot of people out there working really hard to make all of the things that we enjoy still doable, but with privacy built in. And I'm not at all willing to say that that can't happen, even if, you know, our generation is screwed. Maybe they're going to like look at our data forever because, you know, the way they look at the Enron data set of the Enron emails, right? Because they've never had such a rich data set since then. Maybe we'll be that generation, but I don't think that means that we have to accept this as a given.
Irina, let's not accept this. Let's, you know, fight the good fight. But I will ask you the following questions. Do you think there's a risk that whatever we do, that essentially the privacy may be gone in the future because a good algorithm will be able to predict, you know, your next action and what you're going to buy and your views and so on? Do you see the risk of that kind exists at all?
I think that there is a risk, but I think that human beings are unpredictable enough and changeable enough. And this is where you and I disagree the most, I think, based on the research I've read that you've put out. That no, I don't think individual human beings are predictable to that extent. I think we have, you know, you were talking about the brain and DNA as being algorithms and us being driven by those algorithms. I do think we have free will. I think that we take input from a lot of different places, but I don't think we are just data points in a giant algorithm of the world, you know.
Irina, you're completely, sorry, Piero. I just want to say that you are exactly right, that there's essentially, that there's some randomness and some unpredictability to human behavior, but it just all hinges on how do you define predictability. Let me give you an example. If you roll dice, you can predict the outcome with 100% accuracy. And let me give you the prediction. The prediction is, with uniform probability distribution, you'll get outcomes from 1 to 6, right? With 1/6 probability, it will be 1, with 1/6 probability, it will be 2, and so on. So even in systems where there's some randomness built in or some unpredictability, you can still make extremely accurate, essentially probabilistic predictions that take a form of probabilistic distribution. So I agree with you that humans are much more noisy beings than computers or, you know, simple tools and so on. Fully agree with you. But I fully agree that people can change their mind. They can change their political views. We're not, you know, their lives are luckily are not deterministic because it's wonderful. You know, I'm enjoying my non-deterministic life. But also the very fact that even those simple algorithms that we're training today, and we just at the beginning of, and by the way, I'm not training those algorithms. I'm just looking at the hands of people who are training those algorithms. And even those simple algorithms trained today by, you know, companies such as Facebook or Google or whatnot, even there, those algorithms are extremely good at predicting our future behavior, meaning that maybe it's kind of more predictable than we like to think about ourselves. The fact that humans cannot predict something very well doesn't mean that it's not predictable. So I just want to build on your answer, which is that if you guys believe that there's some risk, non-zero risk, then in the future we'll have less privacy than today. I think that today already we should try to take preventive action. It's a bit like with global warming. If you believe there's a risk the temperature is going to go up, let's today start preparing for this negative scenario while also working, trying to, you know, postpone or cancel this negative scenario altogether. And I think that the best way we can do is to try to educate society as much as possible, but also perhaps even more importantly, try to focus more on making societies equal and tolerant. Now, the fact that the privacy of sexual orientation is so important is not just because the privacy as a value is important in its own right. It is, but that's not the main problem. The main problem with the privacy of sexual orientation being important is that in some countries and in some places, even in the US, if your sexual orientation becomes a public knowledge, you're either in trouble or dead, right? So let's try to solve this problem. And if we can solve this problem, even if the end of the privacy doesn't come, I think we'll still be living in a much better world than today.
So algorithms, in my opinion, fail often, but when they fail to predict accurately, that's not good news, because they still predict. The algorithm doesn't know that makes a wrong prediction, and that wrong prediction has a consequence. So as I said from the beginning, algorithms fail, and yes, if they predict correctly what I'm going to do, that is a problem for my privacy. But if they make the wrong prediction, I have a feeling that there's still a consequence, which is not called privacy, it's called something else, but it will have an impact on my life. So now, algorithms, presumably, computer algorithms are going to multiply. Just, I think we all agree that in the free world, that there's a strong financial motivation to have algorithms that are more sophisticated and they run more often, and the computer power is increasing and so on. So what's the final positive comment we can have about this world that will have even more algorithms, even smarter algorithms, even more accurate algorithms?
I think it's good to acknowledge the fact that humans have unlimited creativity, so we can find solutions for that could help make algorithms better for like humanity in the end. Like I was thinking, for example, when Michal was talking about these like Silicon Valley companies that are now in a position where they are making decisions that maybe the government would make in other countries. Maybe there need to be people who are, trained in ethics or trained in international relations or trained in like history and politics, etc. On like in decision-making positions in some of these companies, because otherwise, like for example, the Clubhouse app that's like booming now has already apparently made some missteps when it comes to China. Like it's already on its way to like not accepting Chinese phone numbers, so like excluding Chinese users while apparently negotiating a Chinese version of the app. But like we were wondering with some other like colleague journalists here, like do they know the implications of what they're doing? Like have they just decided that they want to make a lot of money in China, or are they just ignorant about the implications of like doing what the government is asking them? So I think it's important to see that, like, just like you have specialists in technology who work in the government, I think it's important to have like a variety of like people with humanistic backgrounds in tech companies.
So I thought that China had actually banned Clubhouse, which might explain some of what's happening there, but I would need to look into that. I'm not sure. I think in terms of sort of optimism or where we think things might be better, I think we're going to get smarter about, in a way, part of the problem with the conversation tonight is that we're talking about algorithms as if they're one thing, and algorithms depend very much on what the context is, the benefits or the harms of algorithms depend on what the context is. I think we're going to get smarter about which contexts are appropriate for algorithmic decision making and maybe which contexts are not. So you had asked at some point, can we categorize? Look, first of all, there's all this data that's not about human beings. Oceanic data, atmospheric data about agriculture, data about, geology. It all impacts human beings, but you can run algorithms on that and it's fantastic, right? And especially data sets that tend to stay constant or the kind of things that we can measure accurately. And we all agree on what that measurement means. That's fantastic. when we have aspects of society where we don't agree on what the right thing to do is, for example, right? If we talk, I saw at some point Yuval Noah Harari said we will have algorithms that will make better decisions about who we should marry. And my thought was, no, they won't, because we have different notions of what it means to have a good marriage, right? Who gets to decide what that is? So I think if you had an algorithm that tried to determine who you should marry and was trained on data from before legalized gay marriage, it would never suggest that a gay marriage might be the best one for you, right? So I think we have to be really careful about areas where we're talking about human beings and shifting norms, or places where we don't as a society agree on the right thing to do is. And I think we need to be careful not to deploy, sort of simplistic AI solutions in those areas. And if we think that they can be improvements over what we have now, like Michal was saying, like what are you comparing it to, then I think we have to be very humble in how we deploy them at small scale, and we test them and to see whether in fact they are improvements or not. And just because I promised at the beginning to tell you that story about the algorithm in the bedroom, in the child's bedroom, right? I don't want to leave people hanging. So a few years ago, at the Consumer Electronics Society, or Consumer Electronics Show, sorry, it's late in the evening, I'm losing my English. A toy company announced with great fanfare a project of, a product that they were about to release. And sometimes, again, I think that they're like doing this just to troll the ethicists, because the name of this product was Aristotle. And Aristotle was going to be, it was going to start in a child's bedroom as the kind of, the baby monitor kind of camera. And it was going to have that feature, but then it was going to sort of grow with the child. So it would stay in the child's bedroom, and as the child got older, it would sing it lullabies, it would read it bedtime stories, it would learn to understand the child, because we know that with Alexa and with some of these tools, they're not very good at understanding children. So it'd be personalized and learned depending on how this child learned to speak, and would just kind of carry on through teenage years, as kind of this helper for this child. And tens of thousands of people signed a petition saying, please don't bring this to market, because you're basically trying to design an AI parent. And there's a reason why you would prefer to have, a real grown-up sing, even if badly, a lullaby to a child, than to have this tool do it. And long story short, the company decided not to come out with it. So it's pretty rare, I think, that you have this kind of announcement of a product and then this kind of rebellion from from consumers saying, we don't think this is a good idea. That's the kind of thing where I think we have to think about what are the human relationships that would be interfered with, for example, if we deployed it here. What do we lose if we deploy it? It's not that we don't gain anything, right? Parents would have all this time to do other things. Children would potentially hear more bedtime stories than they would otherwise, but we would be losing something really important between those human beings if we allow this kind of thing to come between.
Irina, I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm stealing the story. I'm going to be telling it myself. And
I'm going to send you all the links, all the articles.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. But I must say that listening to it, it made me think about the following, that's true. If you have parents, then hell yeah, just hang out with your parents. But if you're raised by a single mom that doesn't have time because she's working 3 jobs, or if you have no parents and you're being brought up in some shelter home, we know stories of children, essentially going crazy from the lack of stimulation and conversation. So yes, in a perfect society, we don't need any AI to talk to a child. But I must say that I can think of many use cases where an available alternative is being alone in a dark room. And in this case, even talking to your robots sounds like a much better solution. And this applies to so many other contexts, right? If you are living in a small community where everyone trusts each other and you know your neighbors and so on, you don't need a reputation system. Everyone knows, that you can trust each other. If you are living in a country where social capital is lower people don't trust each other. Maybe it's war-torn, maybe just emerged from some very bad crisis, then suddenly having a reputation system, having a credit score, a citizen score, may be a difference between getting a loan or being able to get, you know, a phone or whatnot, and essentially having absolutely zero access to those services. So I essentially just repeat my mantra of always judging a solution against the available alternatives, not available to, you know, a professor from Silicon Valley. Well, I'm very privileged to have access to virtually whatever I want. Well, not through my whole life, but recently. I was also born in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. But essentially, we should always take a perspective of a person that may not be as privileged as we are. And for them, this algorithm may be a difference between, you know, having dinner and not.
Absolutely, but aren't you the one who is saying we should solve society's problems, not the algorithms? You were saying that we should create a more, you know, tolerant and free society, and I completely agree. And if the problem with the single mom is that she doesn't have time to read to the kids, then we should solve that problem, not put an AI in the room to solve the sort of short-term solution. I know, I understand what you're saying, and I completely agree that there are situations in which this would be better than nothing. But I think that's exactly why we should work on the broader things, as you were saying earlier.
Okay, excellent. If you don't have to do it now, but if you have suggestions for books to read, please send them to me, and I will post them on the website of the Lasers. Thank you for this very interesting conversation. It was just a teaser, of course. The argument could be a 6-day symposium. If you have any friends at the DMV, put a good word for me. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Simina, from Beijing. I hope to see you in person as soon as this COVID is over. And thank you, Michal and Irina. Very fascinating, very interesting conversation. Thank you all.